The hush that fell over the dining room was deafening. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations died in a single breath. A man in a charcoal suit, Ethan Caldwell, tech billionaire and master negotiator, sat frozen at the head of the table. Across from him, his Japanese business partners exchanged polite smiles that masked growing confusion. The translator he depended on was nowhere to be found. His empire, his deal, his reputation, all hanging in silence. At that moment, a quiet voice broke through the tension. "Sumimasen, Caldwell-san," said a woman in a black and white uniform. She was older than the other waitresses, her hair pulled neatly into a bun, her presence calm yet invisible until now. The guests turned their heads. She placed a dish in front of the Japanese chairman, bowed lightly, and continued in flawless Japanese. The entire room froze again. Clara Dawson never planned to speak. She had promised herself to stay invisible, just serve, smile, and survive. But years of teaching Japanese before her husband's medical bills drowned them had left her with instincts too strong to bury. She had seen the panic in Ethan Caldwell's eyes, the desperate glance toward the empty chair where the translator should have been. And she couldn't stand by. Ethan blinked, unsure of what he was hearing. The woman was translating accurately, gracefully, even capturing tone and nuance. The Japanese chairman's stern face softened into a warm smile. Clara's words bridged the gap that millions of dollars couldn't. The pianist stopped playing. The manager froze near the bar, lips parted. No one dared interrupt as this middle-aged waitress moved the negotiation forward with the elegance of a diplomat. Ethan leaned forward. "You speak Japanese?" His voice, once sharp, was low and stunned. Clara kept her eyes on the chairman, finishing the sentence before turning to him. "Enough to help you save a contract, sir." A ripple of astonishment swept through the room. The Japanese executives began to nod approvingly. Their lead negotiator laughed softly, responding through Clara, and within minutes the tone had shifted from tense to celebratory. Champagne glasses refilled. A deal worth over $1 million was signed before dessert arrived. When it was over, Clara stepped back, heart pounding. She didn't smile. She simply bowed again and slipped toward the kitchen. Ethan watched her go, unable to find words. The entire evening had flipped in seconds from humiliation to triumph, all because a waitress refused to let a man drown in silence. Behind the swinging doors, Clara exhaled shakily. Her hands trembled, but her voice in her mind was steady. "You did what was right. That's enough." Out in the dining hall, Ethan lifted his glass, still dazed, his mind replaying the sound of her voice, the voice that had just saved his empire. Clara stayed late that night, polishing wine glasses until her hands ached and her reflection blurred in the crystal. The restaurant was almost empty, save for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the clink of cutlery being sorted in the back. She could still hear the echoes of the dinner, the laughter that returned after the deal was signed, the murmured congratulations, the sudden warmth that filled the room once the crisis had passed. But what lingered most was the stunned silence that had preceded it. The moment her voice had bridged two worlds and shifted the balance of power in a room full of men who had never noticed her before. She didn't expect gratitude. People like her weren't thanked. They were tolerated until the next shift began. Still, when the manager walked toward her with an unreadable expression, she braced herself for the reprimand. "You had no authorization to speak," he said quietly, his tone clipped but not cruel. "But what you did tonight saved us all from embarrassment." His eyes softened slightly. "Go home, Clara. And don't let the other staff know what you're capable of. It might make them nervous." Outside, the city glowed under the drizzle of midnight rain. Clara pulled her coat tight and walked toward the subway, her shoes clicking softly against the wet pavement. She thought of her husband, once a literature professor, now confined to a hospital bed 2 hours away. Every paycheck she earned was a brick in the wall that kept their lives from collapsing. Tonight, though, something had shifted inside her, a quiet pride she hadn't felt in years. She had spoken again, not for money, not for approval, but because silence would have been the greater sin. The following evening, when she returned to Aurora Prime, the air in the dining hall felt charged. colleagues whispered as she passed, eyes flicking toward her and away again. Someone had talked. Someone always did. By the time she reached the locker room, she already knew the story had spread. "Did you really talk to the Japanese guy like a pro?" asked Mira, the youngest waitress, her eyes wide with admiration. Clara forced a small smile. "It was nothing. He needed help." Mira grinned. "You should have seen Caldwell's face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost." That night, the restaurant's routine felt heavier. The chandeliers sparkled as usual, the guests arrived in designer suits, but something about the air had changed. Ethan Caldwell was scheduled to return with his legal team for a follow-up dinner, and every employee was on edge. The manager's instructions were clear. Professional, silent, flawless service. No interruptions. Clara nodded with the rest, pretending her heart wasn't hammering. When Ethan walked in, the murmur of conversation faltered for just a second. He moved with controlled confidence, his presence drawing attention without effort. He took the same seat at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers and assistants, and for a brief moment his gaze caught hers. It wasn't the cold appraisal of a man assessing staff. It was curiosity, laced with something like respect. He didn't smile, but the acknowledgement was enough to make Clara's breath hitch. Dinner unfolded with mechanical precision. Plates glided out, wine was poured, polite laughter punctuated the air. Clara kept her movements fluid and professional, but she could feel his eyes on her whenever she approached. Halfway through the main course, a translator appeared, a young man in a tailored suit, speaking with confidence, but none of Clara's empathy. The Japanese guests listened, their expressions polite but distant. Clara could tell the rhythm was off. Translation was more than words. It was tone, rhythm, respect. Ethan sensed it too. His jaw tightened, and his pen tapped a slow, frustrated beat against the tablecloth. Then, without warning, the Japanese chairman turned to Clara, bypassing the translator entirely. "You were the one who spoke yesterday, weren't you?" he asked gently in Japanese. The table fell silent. The translator froze. Clara bowed slightly, her pulse racing. "Yes, sir," she replied in the same language. The chairman smiled. "You speak like someone who listens. That's rare." "Oh?" Ethan's gaze flicked between them, a spark of understanding dawning in his eyes. The translator awkwardly stepped back, and Clara continued the conversation with practiced humility. The atmosphere lightened instantly. Laughter returned, genuine and full. The chairman toasted to bridges built by sincerity, and even Ethan's rigid composure softened into a quiet smile. When the guests finally departed, leaving a trail of empty glasses and satisfied murmurs, Ethan lingered by the table. "You've done this before," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Once," she admitted. "A lifetime ago." He nodded, studying her face with the look of a man realizing how little he'd seen before. "You saved my reputation last night. Tonight, you saved my dignity." Clara didn't know how to respond. Compliments from men like him often came wrapped in conditions, but there was something different in his tone, sincere, almost reverent. "I just spoke when no one else would," she said finally. Ethan's eyes held hers for a moment longer, then he extended his hand. Sometimes that's what leadership really is. The next morning, a message waited in her locker, a sealed envelope bearing the company's crest. Inside was a handwritten note. To the woman who turned silence into diplomacy. "Let's talk about a position where your voice can be heard." Underneath lay a simple business card signed Ethan Caldwell, CEO. Clara sat on the bench, the paper trembling in her hand. For the first time in years, the weight of survival lifted slightly from her chest. She didn't know what the future held, only that, after a lifetime of being overlooked, she had finally been seen. Outside, the morning sun broke through the city haze, scattering gold across the glass towers. Clara walked toward the light with quiet purpose, her reflection steady in every passing window, the echo of last night's applause following her into a new day. For the next few days, Clara moved through the restaurant, as if balancing on invisible glass, careful not to let the attention disturb the fragile calm she had rebuilt. The staff still whispered when she passed, their voices soft but charged with wonder, and though she kept her head down, she could feel the shift in how people looked at her. They no longer saw just a waitress. They saw the woman who had spoken fluently in the language of power, who had turned a moment of crisis into a triumph that even the manager could not take credit for. Yet for Clara, the praise felt hollow, like applause echoing in an empty room. All she wanted was to finish her shift, visit her husband in the hospital, and pretend the world outside didn't expect her to be anyone other than who she had always been: quiet, efficient, invisible. The letter from Ethan lay folded in her purse, unread for the third time. She had considered throwing it away, afraid of what it might ask of her, afraid of stepping into a life that once cost her everything. When she finally opened it, the message was simple: "You changed the course of a deal with words. Let's see what else your words can change." Beneath it, an invitation lunch at his company's Manhattan headquarters. She stared at the embossed logo, the weight of it heavy in her palm, torn between curiosity and caution. She had been burned before by powerful men who promised opportunity and left her to clean the ashes. Still, something in Ethan's tone lingered, something that sounded less like an order and more like respect. 2 days later, she found herself standing in front of the gleaming tower of Caldwell Systems, her reflection merging with the sky-high glass facade. Inside, everything smelled of money and precision: marble floors, soft lighting, a reception desk that looked carved from ice. An assistant led her to a private conference room overlooking the Hudson River. Ethan stood by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms, the city unfolding behind him like a living painting. When he turned, the confidence in his gaze was tempered by something gentler: gratitude, perhaps, or the humility of a man who had been forced to confront his own limits. "Thank you for coming," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I know this is unusual." Clara smiled faintly. "Unusual seems to be a theme lately." He laughed softly, the sound genuine, and for the first time she saw a trace of weariness in his posture. "You probably think I invited you here to offer money or a position. I'm not. I wanted to ask you a question instead." She waited, her expression calm but guarded. "How did you stay so composed that night?" Clara took a slow breath, her eyes drifting to the city skyline. "When you've lost enough, composure becomes a habit. I used to teach language diplomacy before my husband's accident. Words were my living. Then life decided to test if I could survive without them." Ethan studied her in silence, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You weren't supposed to fade into a restaurant kitchen," he said quietly. "People like you belong in rooms where decisions are made." She met his gaze with a small, sad smile. "People like me have bills, Mr. Caldwell. Decisions don't pay them, shift work does." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for a folder and slid it across the table. "I can't change your past, but I can offer you something different. We're launching a cultural bridging initiative between our U.S. and Asian divisions. I want you to lead the training, as an advisor, not a waitress." Clara froze, staring at the document. Her name was printed at the top in bold letters. It felt like a ghost of the life she'd left behind had suddenly reached out to reclaim her. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "You already did, Clara. You saved $1 million partnership with nothing but instinct and integrity. That's not something I can teach. That's something I can only trust." His words struck something deep inside her, the place where fear and dignity lived side by side. She thought of her husband, of hospital lights and unpaid bills, of years spent folding herself into small spaces so she wouldn't be noticed. For the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to take up space again. By the time she left the building, the sun had begun to set, painting the river in shades of copper and rose. She walked slowly, the offer still pulsing in her hands like a heartbeat. She stopped by the hospital that evening, sitting beside her husband's bed, as the machines hummed softly. He opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "You look lighter," he murmured, his voice thin but warm. Clara brushed his hand gently. "Maybe I finally remembered who I used to be." Weeks passed, and Aurora Prime adjusted to her absence. Rumors swirled that she'd been hired by Caldwell Systems, and though no one knew the details, everyone agreed that she had deserved better than a uniform and a name tag. When she returned one night to pick up her final paycheck, even the manager seemed humbled. "You proved something to all of us," he said, offering a rare smile, "that sometimes the smallest voice can carry the most weight." Months later, Ethan invited her to a formal event, a dinner honoring cross-cultural initiatives. The venue was grand, filled with people in tailored suits and silk gowns. Yet, when Clara took the stage to speak, the room fell silent in the same way it had that night in the restaurant. She spoke not as a server, but as a bridge between languages, between worlds, between the powerful and the forgotten. Her words flowed with quiet conviction, and when she finished, the applause rose like a wave, thunderous and sincere. After the ceremony, Ethan approached her, eyes bright. "You once said you just spoke when no one else would," he reminded her. "That's still true," she replied softly. "Only now, people are finally listening." They stood by the tall windows, watching the city lights flicker across the water. The world beyond was vast, unpredictable, but Clara no longer feared it. Her story didn't end with wealth or romance, but with something rarer, a reclamation of self-worth. The waitress who once saved a billionaire from silence had learned that her own voice was the one that needed saving all along. And as the music swelled and laughter echoed around her, Clara Dawson smiled not for the crowd, not for gratitude, but for the simple truth that dignity, once reclaimed, never leaves quietly. The following year unfolded like a slow, deliberate breath, each day stretching wider than the one before it, as Clara settled into her new role. She had gone from carrying trays and wiping glasses to leading small teams of analysts and cultural consultants, each of them eager to learn the art of communication beyond words. At first, the change felt unreal. The polished conference rooms, the careful greetings, and the steady hum of translation devices all seemed a world away from the clatter of cutlery and the smell of roasted garlic that had defined her nights at Aurora Prime. Yet beneath the surface of this new calm, Clara sensed that every step forward carried the weight of her past, reminding her that grace was often built on scars. Ethan visited her department often, sometimes with a quick question, sometimes with a silent nod that meant more than any formal praise. He had learned to trust her instincts, to ask for her counsel when navigating the delicate web of cross-continental partnerships that his empire relied upon. What began as professional respect gradually deepened into quiet companionship, though neither of them dared to name it. They shared long conversations about the ethics of business, about the loneliness of leadership, about the strange peace that comes from understanding another language well enough to feel its pauses. But beneath the surface of success, an old shadow was stirring. One afternoon, during a debrief meeting with the executive board, Clara noticed a subtle tension. A younger executive named Bryce, ambitious and restless, questioned her methods with the polite venom of someone testing boundaries. "With all due respect, Mrs. Dawson," he said smoothly, "I'm not sure we should base company diplomacy on intuition and sentimentality. This is business, not therapy." A few heads nodded. Others avoided her eyes. Clara met his challenge calmly, her voice measured. "Understanding people isn't sentimentality, Mr. Bryce. It's strategy. Without empathy, business is just expensive guesswork." The room went still. Even Ethan said nothing for a long moment before adding quietly, "She's right. Strategy without empathy collapses faster than trust." That evening, as she packed her things, Clara found a note slipped under her office door. "Be careful who you embarrass in front of the board." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a signature to know where it came from. The warning chilled her, not because she feared losing her position, but because she recognized the tone. It was the same quiet threat she'd once heard from a former dean, the man who had stolen her research, ruined her career, and left her scrambling for survival a decade earlier. The world changed its clothes, but power always whispered in the same voice. Days passed, and the tension thickened. Bryce began subtly undermining her projects, sending conflicting instructions to her team, leaking selective details of her work to make her look inconsistent. Yet Clara refused to react. She had learned the art of waiting, of letting her silence do the heavy lifting. The more he spoke, the more his own arrogance betrayed him. When the board called for a quarterly review, she arrived prepared not with accusations, but with data. Each slide she presented exposed his tampering without naming him outright. Numbers, emails, timestamps, and performance graphs told the story more clearly than any confrontation ever could. By the time she finished, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. Ethan, who had watched in restrained fury, finally broke the silence. "Impressive work, Mrs. Dawson," he said evenly. "You've managed to turn a problem into proof." Bryce sat stiffly, color draining from his face. "It seems," Ethan continued, "that our company has underestimated the value of truth delivered calmly." The meeting ended without further comment, but the message was unmistakable. Bryce was reassigned to a subsidiary office by the end of the week. That night, Clara stood by the window of her office, the city stretching endlessly below her. She wasn't triumphant. Victory felt too heavy a word for what she had done. It was something quieter, steadier, a restoration of balance. Ethan joined her, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "You didn't have to fight him so politely," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Politeness is just control disguised as kindness. It makes men like him underestimate me." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're terrifying, you know that?" "Only to those who mistake silence for weakness," she replied. Over the following months, Caldwell Systems flourished under her influence. Her training modules reshaped internal communication across continents, reducing conflicts and building partnerships once thought impossible. Journalists began referring to her as the company's bridge architect, though she avoided interviews and declined invitations to panels, preferring the quiet satisfaction of watching others succeed. Her husband's health had improved enough for him to return home under partial care, and when she visited him after work, he would listen to her stories with the pride of someone who had always believed she would find her way back to herself. But change, no matter how gentle, always brings a test. During an international summit in Tokyo, Clara and Ethan faced an unexpected crisis when a deal worth several $100 million began to crumble over a mistranslation in the legal documents. The Japanese partners felt slighted, the Americans defensive, and the entire negotiation teetered on collapse. Ethan turned to her quietly amid the chaos. "Do you trust your instincts again?" he asked. Clara inhaled slowly, then stood. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the room as she addressed both sides in fluent Japanese, her tone carrying not authority but respect. She explained the misunderstanding, apologized for the oversight, and reframed the deal not as a transaction but as a partnership built on shared honor. The tension melted like frost under sunlight. Minutes later, the signatures were made, the cameras flashed, and applause rippled through the room. As they left the summit, Ethan walked beside her, saying nothing until they reached the car. "You saved us again," he said quietly. "Not me," she corrected. "You listened. That's rarer than speaking." He smiled, conceding the point. When they returned to New York, a small envelope awaited Clara at her office. Inside was a handwritten note from the Japanese chairman. "In every generation, there is one who speaks truth so softly that even pride must lean closer to hear it. You are that voice." That night, standing on her balcony with the city lights sprawling like constellations below, Clara felt a rare peace settle over her. She realized that her life had become a circle, not the kind that traps, but the kind that completes. From a forgotten waitress to a woman whose words shaped nations, her journey had never really been about ambition. It had always been about reclaiming the dignity that silence once stole. And as the wind brushed against her face, carrying the faint hum of a city that finally knew her name, Clara Dawson closed her eyes and smiled not for victory, but for quiet redemption. Spring arrived in New York with a kind of fragile warmth, the kind that made the city glimmer even beneath its scars. Clara often lingered outside the office before heading home, watching the streetlights bloom like lanterns along the avenues. The rhythm of her life had found a steady pulse again: morning meetings, late calls with foreign partners, quiet weekends visiting her husband. Yet under the calm routine, she could sense a faint unease moving through the air, a change too subtle to name but too real to ignore. Power never slept long, and peace in business was only ever an intermission. Rumors began to surface about an internal audit targeting the new cross-cultural program she had built. Some said it was a routine review. Others whispered that certain board members were dissatisfied with her growing influence. Clara knew better than to panic. She had lived too many lives under scrutiny to mistake gossip for danger, but when she saw Bryce's name reappear on a memo now promoted to oversee financial transparency, she felt a flicker of foreboding. He had returned, not humbled, but recalibrated. At the next executive meeting, Bryce presented a report with the polished precision of a man who'd rehearsed every syllable. He smiled as he spoke about accountability, efficiency, and misplaced resources, and though he never said her name, every example cut close to her department. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable, his pen motionless in his hand. When the presentation ended, the silence felt heavy enough to break glass. Bryce's eyes glimmered with triumph disguised as professionalism. "Of course," he said lightly, "none of this implies wrongdoing. It's simply about clarity." Clara met his gaze and smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clarity," she said, her voice soft but steady, "depends on where you're standing when the light hits." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's lips curved into the faintest shadow of approval. The meeting adjourned without conclusion, but the tension stayed behind like static after lightning. That evening, Ethan called her into his office. "He's playing a long game," he said quietly. "He's hoping to make you overreact." Clara folded her hands on her lap, her voice calm. "Then I won't. He wants spectacle. I'll give him silence." Ethan studied her, worry flickering across his face. "I can protect you politically, but if this turns into a public scandal," she interrupted gently, "then I'll do what I always do, translate the truth." Days turned into weeks, and the audit deepened. Bryce leaked selective information to a trade publication, twisting her project's expenses into headlines about corporate waste. Online commentators feasted on the story of a waitress-turned-executive caught in controversy. The public loved irony more than accuracy. Clara's inbox flooded with requests for comment, but she ignored them all. Instead, she focused on preparing her documentation: every invoice, every communication record, every letter of endorsement from international partners who had benefited from her program. She didn't build a defense, she built a mirror. When the board summoned her for a formal hearing, the conference room was packed. Cameras from the internal media team stood ready to document the proceedings, ensuring transparency. Bryce opened the session with rehearsed concern. "No one doubts Mrs. Dawson's contributions," he began, "but questions remain regarding the efficiency of her initiatives and the allocation of company funds." He spoke like a prosecutor wearing a velvet glove. Clara listened in silence, her composure disarming him more than anger ever could. When it was her turn, she stood, adjusted the microphone, and began not with justification but with story. "A year ago," she said, "this company nearly lost a multi-million-dollar contract because a conversation stopped midway between two languages. We survived not because of policy or profit, but because someone dared to bridge silence." She paused, letting the words breathe. This program was born from that night not to glorify diplomacy, but to remind us that communication is the most ethical form of profit. Then she presented her records, each one projected on the screen with deliberate precision, proof of every expenditure, correspondence, and outcome. Her tone remained calm, her gaze unwavering. "Every figure you see represents not expense, but trust. Trust built, trust measured, trust returned." By the time she finished, the room had changed. The air no longer belonged to Bryce. It belonged to her. Ethan was the first to speak. "That will be enough," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of finality. Bryce tried to interject, but Ethan's stare silenced him. "You mistook integrity for fragility, and that's your miscalculation," he said, each word sharp and deliberate. The board voted unanimously to retain the program. Bryce's position was reconsidered, and by the next quarter his office nameplate had vanished. After the hearing, Ethan found Clara standing by the lobby's tall windows, watching rain streak down the glass. "You handled that like a diplomat," he said. She smiled faintly. "I handled it like a waitress who's seen too many arguments over cold soup." He laughed, shaking his head. "You make humility look like a weapon." "Only because no one expects it to cut," she replied softly. Weeks later, the company hosted a gala celebrating its record growth. Ethan insisted Clara attend, and though she protested, he reminded her gently, "You've earned your place in the light." The event was opulent crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, an orchestra playing beneath a ceiling of gold. Clara felt out of place among the sequins and designer perfumes, but when she saw the international delegates greeting her warmly, she realized she was no longer the outsider. She was the bridge that made the gathering possible. As the night wound down, Ethan joined her on the terrace overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered like a galaxy scattered across the horizon. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. She thought for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes, but quiet means nothing if it's forced. I prefer the kind you earn after being heard." He looked at her with a quiet admiration that no longer needed to hide behind professionalism. "You changed more than this company, Clara. You changed the way I see people." She turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the city's glow. "And what do you see now?" He smiled. "Someone who reminds me that power is only noble when it listens." The wind swept between them, carrying the faint scent of spring rain and jasmine. For the first time, Clara didn't flinch from being seen. That night, as she returned home and stood by her window, the city below felt softer, almost kind. The woman staring back at her reflection no longer carried the weight of invisibility. She carried something stronger, tranquility earned through truth. In a world built on noise and ambition, Clara Dawson had mastered the rarest language of all. The quiet courage to speak when it mattered, and the grace to stay silent once justice had already spoken. Autumn came early that year, painting New York in shades of copper and fading gold, as if the whole city were exhaling after a long summer of ambition. Clara found herself walking slower on her way to work, watching the trees shed their leaves like quiet declarations of surrender. Her days had grown calmer now that the noise around her name had faded. The company had stabilized, the gossip had moved on, and the endless scrutiny had finally turned toward someone else. Yet, even in peace, Clara felt the faint pull of something unfinished, a sense that her story had not yet found its full circle, that redemption always carried one final test. Ethan noticed it too. He had grown to read her silences the way others read a book, tracing meaning in the pauses between her words. Over the months, their friendship had matured into something softer and steadier, built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding that neither sought to disturb. Sometimes they shared lunch in his office, discussing projects, travel, or philosophy. Other times, they simply sat in companionable quiet, looking out at the skyline, as if waiting for the city itself to speak. But that calm began to shift when an invitation arrived from Tokyo. The Japanese conglomerate that had first partnered with Caldwell Systems wanted both of them to attend a new signing ceremony. "They asked for you by name," Ethan said, sliding the letter across her desk. "Apparently the chairman insists the bridge that began the deal must be there to close it." Clara studied the elegant handwriting, a mixture of flattery and foreboding curling through her chest. "It's an honor," she said finally, "and a reminder that words have long shadows." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure they cast the right one." The trip to Tokyo felt like déjà vu painted in softer tones. The same boardroom awaited them, but the energy had changed. The men who once eyed her with polite skepticism now greeted her with deep bows and unguarded warmth. Yet as the formalities began, Clara sensed an undercurrent of tension. The translation technology being demonstrated by Caldwell's subsidiary malfunctioned halfway through the presentation, twisting phrases into awkward mistranslations. Laughter rippled through the crowd, light but cutting, and for a heartbeat Ethan looked like the man she had first seen at Aurora Prime, powerful yet helpless in the face of misunderstanding. Without waiting to be asked, Clara rose from her seat. She moved to the podium, her tone poised and unhurried, addressing both sides in fluent Japanese. "Technology fails when it forgets that language is not code," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "It is intention, breath, and respect." The room fell silent as she gently corrected the mistranslated phrases, turning embarrassment into grace. Within minutes, the tension dissolved into applause. Ethan exhaled softly, his shoulders easing as pride flickered in his eyes. Later, as they stepped out into the crisp evening air, he said quietly, "Every time I think I've seen you at your best, you find a new height." They walked together through the neon-lit streets of Shinjuku, where the city pulsed like a living organism, bright and endless. Clara watched the lights reflect off the rain-slick pavement and thought of the years she had spent in darkness, unseen and unacknowledged. "I used to believe silence was safety," she murmured. "Now I think silence is just a room you build when you're afraid of the world hearing your truth." Ethan glanced at her, his voice low. "And what do you believe now?" She smiled gently. "That truth, when spoken kindly, can save people, even those who don't know they need saving." Back in New York, their return sparked attention again, though this time it was celebratory. News outlets hailed Clara as a symbol of intercultural diplomacy, the woman who had turned language into the company's most valuable asset. Invitations to speak at universities and conferences poured in, but she declined most of them. "Stories sound cleaner when told from a distance," she told Ethan. "I prefer to live them close." He nodded, understanding that her humility was not an act but a form of discipline, the same calm restraint that made her powerful. One evening, she visited her husband's grave in Queens. The sky had darkened early, and the wind carried the scent of rain. She placed a small bundle of chrysanthemums on the stone and spoke softly. "You used to say words could build worlds. I didn't believe you until they built one for me." Her voice wavered slightly, but her heart felt steady. She stood there for a long time, listening to the rustle of leaves and the faraway hum of traffic, feeling as though the world had finally forgiven her for surviving. A few weeks later, the company held an awards ceremony to honor its cultural division's success. Clara tried to stand at the back of the room, but Ethan insisted she take the stage. "You taught us that language isn't about who speaks loudest," he said to the audience. "It's about who listens hardest." When he handed her the plaque, their hands brushed briefly, and though nothing was said, something in that moment shifted quietly between them. That night, after the applause faded and the guests dispersed, they lingered in the empty hall. The chandeliers threw golden halos across the marble floor, echoing the night everything began. Ethan looked at her, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You know, Clara, that first night you spoke up, you didn't just save a deal. You saved me from arrogance, from blindness, from thinking I understood people when I didn't." She met his gaze, her own eyes glistening. Then we saved each other, in different ways. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the rain, reflections trembling like liquid light. They walked together beneath one umbrella, saying little, because there was nothing left to prove. The waitress who once froze a room with her courage had become the woman who could quiet it with her peace. Months later, when Clara retired from Caldwell Systems, she declined the farewell party and instead left a handwritten note on the office bulletin board. "Power speaks. Wisdom listens. Thank you for teaching me both." The words stayed long after she was gone, a quiet testament to the woman who had turned service into leadership and humility into strength. Years down the line, her story would be told in classrooms and leadership seminars as an example of grace under pressure. But for Clara, the legacy was simpler. On her porch overlooking the Hudson, she spent her mornings sipping tea, translating poetry for pleasure, her cat sleeping on the railing, the world moving gently around her. She had learned that the truest victories make no noise. They simply breathe, like the soft wind at dawn, steady, unseen, and enough. Winter returned with a hush that blanketed Manhattan in silver, softening even the sharpest corners of the city that never slept. Snow gathered on the ledges of high-rise buildings and along the steps of the Caldwell Systems headquarters, where Clara had once walked in every morning before sunrise. Now she only visited occasionally, consulting part-time on special projects or mentoring new hires who came seeking the legend behind the company's moral shift. Her days were slower, quieter, but never empty. In the stillness, she had found rhythm. In distance, she had found clarity. Yet as the year drew to a close, an unexpected letter arrived that stirred something deep within her. A letter from Ethan, written in his distinct, measured handwriting, asking her to meet one last time before the new year. When she arrived at the restaurant he'd chosen, a sense of déjà vu wrapped around her like a familiar melody. It wasn't Aurora Prime, but the space bore its echo: soft lighting, crystal glasses, the muted hum of live piano music drifting through the air. Ethan stood near the window overlooking the city, older now, a little grayer at the temples, yet carrying that same steady composure she remembered from the night everything had changed. He smiled as she approached, his eyes reflecting both joy and a trace of melancholy. "I thought it was fitting to end where it began," he said, gesturing for her to sit. They spoke for hours, their conversation moving with the ease of old friends who had shared both triumph and silence. Ethan spoke of his decision to step down as CEO, to hand the company over to a younger board while he pursued philanthropic work abroad. Clara listened, proud yet thoughtful. "You built something that outgrew you," she said softly. "That's the sign of real leadership." He nodded slowly. "And you built the part of it that mattered, the conscience." When the meal ended, Ethan handed her a small envelope, simple and cream-colored, sealed with wax. "It's not business," he said when she hesitated. "Just something I wanted you to read." Inside was a handwritten dedication for a scholarship fund, in her name the Clara Dawson Fellowship for Cross-Cultural Communication. "You taught me that language isn't a skill," he said. "It's an act of mercy." For a moment Clara couldn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced her name on the paper, realizing it would outlive her, teaching others what she had once fought to remember, that words could heal what pride had broken. Outside, the snow was falling harder, muffling the sounds of the city. They walked side by side toward the corner where their paths would diverge. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "what would have happened if you hadn't spoken that night?" She smiled faintly, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold. "Then the world would have lost a little bit of understanding, and I would still be hiding behind silence." He stopped walking, his gaze steady. "I think I would have lost more than that." For a heartbeat, their eyes held, and in that unspoken moment, gratitude and affection intertwined, timeless and beyond definition. After they parted, Clara stood beneath a street lamp, watching the snow spiral through the golden light. She thought of her younger self, the weary waitress polishing glasses, the woman who had once believed invisibility was safety. How far she had come from that night when courage had taken the shape of a single sentence. Now her courage was quieter, no longer desperate but deliberate, born from understanding rather than rebellion. She realized that redemption didn't arrive as applause or recognition. It arrived as peace, the kind that settled into your bones and asked for nothing more. In the weeks that followed, letters began to arrive from scholarship recipients, students from small towns, single mothers, immigrants rebuilding their lives, each of them thanking her for making their dreams possible. Clara replied to every letter by hand, her responses written with the same careful rhythm she used when translating poetry. She told them that words were more than tools for ambition. They were bridges for compassion, proof that understanding could still exist in a world built on competition. Her advice was simple. Listen longer than you speak, and you'll learn what power really sounds like. As winter melted into spring, Clara returned once more to Aurora Prime, not as an employee, but as a guest. The restaurant had changed ownership, but a few of the old staff still recognized her. She sat at a corner table near the same marble pillar where she had once stood trembling with a tray in her hands. The new waitress approached, nervous and apologetic, explaining that her English wasn't perfect yet. Clara smiled warmly. "Neither is anyone's," she said gently. "That's why we keep trying," the girl laughed, relief softening her face, and Clara realized she had just passed forward the very grace that had once saved her. Later that evening, as she stepped outside into the mild spring air, the city felt kinder than it had in years. The skyscrapers no longer loomed like fortresses of ambition but glimmered like lighthouses, each window a small testament to survival. The world hadn't changed much, but she had, and that was enough. A few months later, Ethan's foundation invited her to deliver a keynote address at an international summit on human communication. She hesitated at first, reluctant to stand in the spotlight again, but eventually she agreed, realizing that her story no longer belonged solely to her. On stage, beneath the soft glow of the auditorium lights, she began with the sentence that had once frozen a room. "Language is the last bridge we build when everything else falls apart." The audience leaned in, captivated. She spoke about dignity, about empathy, about the quiet power of listening. Her words carried the weight of lived truth, and when the applause came, it felt less like celebration and more like closure. That night, back in her hotel room overlooking the sea of city lights, Clara stood by the window and closed her eyes. Somewhere below, people were still chasing deals, still shouting across tables, still mistaking noise for influence. But she no longer needed to chase anything. Her legacy was not written in headlines or board decisions. It was written in the quiet lives she had touched, the bridges she had built without ever raising her voice. As the night deepened, she whispered a soft prayer to the city that had both broken and rebuilt her. May every silence find its voice. May every act of courage find its witness. Then, with the calm certainty of a woman who had nothing left to prove, Clara Dawson turned away from the window and smiled, knowing that some stories do not end. They simply keep echoing softly, endlessly, in the hearts they've changed forever. The following summer unfolded with a gentle grace that Clara had not felt in decades, a season that seemed to breathe slower, softer, as if time itself had decided to give her back all the moments it once stole. The mornings began with sunlight pooling across her kitchen table, the faint aroma of chamomile tea rising like a familiar lullaby, and the rhythmic hum of the Hudson drifting through the open window. The city outside no longer roared with urgency. It murmured, patient and alive, like an old friend. Clara's life had found its balance, a delicate harmony between solitude and connection, between the past that had shaped her and the peace that now defined her. She still kept in touch with Ethan, though their conversations had shifted from strategy and deadlines to philosophy and small joys. They exchanged letters more than calls, both preferring the intimacy of handwriting. His most recent letter came from Kyoto, where he was overseeing a humanitarian program that trained translators to mediate in post-conflict regions. "You started this," he wrote. "Every bridge I build now stands on the foundation of what you taught me, that empathy is the purest form of intelligence." Clara smiled as she read those words, folding the letter neatly beside her teacup. She didn't need grand gestures to feel fulfilled. The knowledge that her influence still rippled outward was enough. Yet even in peace, the world found its ways to remind her that perfection was temporary. One morning, a call came from Caldwell Systems. The new board requested her advice on a brewing diplomatic misstep involving a government client overseas. She hesitated at first, reluctant to re-enter the noise she had so carefully left behind, but something in the voice of the young executive who reached out reminded her of herself years ago, uncertain, but trying to do the right thing. "I'll come," she said finally, "but only to listen first." "Oh." When Clara stepped back into the company headquarters, it felt both foreign and familiar. The faces had changed, but the energy, the pulse of ambition mixed with insecurity remained the same. The boardroom was filled with tension when she entered, the air thick with overlapping voices and self-defense. She took a seat quietly, waited for the room to settle, and then spoke with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. "You're not arguing over policy," she said evenly. "You're arguing over pride. The difference is subtle, but pride never translates." Her words hung in the air, heavy but liberating. The debate dissolved into reflection. Within an hour, the conflict unraveled, and solutions began to take shape. When the meeting ended, the young executive approached her, gratitude shining through exhaustion. "How do you stay so calm when everyone else panics?" he asked. Clara smiled gently. "Because panic is loud, and truth whispers. If you want to hear it, you have to quiet the noise first." He nodded, repeating the words softly as though committing them to memory. For Clara, that moment meant more than any title she'd ever held. It was the passing of a quiet inheritance, the kind that outlives applause. After that day, Clara returned home and resumed her quiet rituals. The small garden behind her townhouse had flourished in her absence, lavender bending under the weight of bees, ivy creeping up the old fence, sunlight spilling across the stones like gold dust. She spent the afternoons reading letters from her former students and scholarship recipients. One had just become a UN interpreter. Another had started a nonprofit that taught language skills to refugees. Every story carried echoes of her own, a reminder that the smallest act of compassion could ripple across continents. That evening, she took out an old photo album, one she hadn't opened in years. The pages held fragments of her journey. The restaurant where it all began, a faded picture of her husband smiling beside her, a newspaper clipping from the day the scholarship was founded. Each image was a doorway leading her back through the corridors of memory where joy and sorrow walked hand in hand. She paused at a photograph of Ethan handing her the fellowship plaque. His expression in that picture held the same sincerity that had changed the trajectory of her life. "You taught me that power listens," he had said. She whispered the words again now, softly to herself, like a prayer. As dusk deepened, Clara stepped outside, the sky bleeding into hues of amber and violet. The city lights flickered on one by one, like tiny affirmations of endurance. She walked down to the waterfront, her cane tapping gently against the pavement, her reflection gliding beside her in the still water. Around her, strangers passed, some hurrying, some lost in their own thoughts, but she felt connected to all of them in a way she hadn't before. Every person, she realized, carried a language of their own, not spoken but lived, written in gestures, glances, and the way they held their silence. She found a bench and sat watching the river. The air smelled faintly of rain and metal, the scent of the city's pulse. Closing her eyes, she listened not for words this time, but for rhythm, the distant thrum of car engines, the flutter of pigeons' wings, the laughter of a child echoing from the park behind her. It all blended into a single living melody, the same music she had heard years ago when she first chose to speak. Only now, it sounded fuller, wiser, complete. When she opened her eyes again, the first stars had begun to appear, trembling above the skyline. She thought of everything she had survived, the hunger, the loss, the humiliation, the rediscovery, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The woman who once fought to be heard had become the one teaching others to listen. The waitress had become a mentor, the outsider, a symbol of connection. And in that realization, she found peace not as a finish line but as a continuum, a quiet current that carried her forward, steady and infinite. On her way home, she passed a small cafe and saw a young waitress struggling to communicate with a group of foreign tourists. The girl's face was flushed, her hands fidgeting with a notepad. Clara smiled, stepped inside, and gently offered, "May I help translate?" The girl's relief was instant, and together they navigated the order with laughter and ease. As the customers left, the young waitress turned to her and said, "I don't know how you did that." Clara's eyes softened. "It's simple," she replied. "I just listened until I understood." When she walked back into the evening, the streetlights stretched long shadows behind her, blending into the hum of the city. The world no longer demanded her voice, it had learned to echo it. And as the night wind brushed across her face, Clara Dawson smiled, a quiet, enduring smile that belonged not to victory or survival, but to understanding. For in the end, that was the truest legacy of all. A single act of kindness that never stopped translating, even long after the words themselves had faded into silence. The first hints of autumn crept back into the city, painting the leaves in soft rust and bronze, turning every breeze into a whisper of memory. Clara had grown to love this season more than any other. It reminded her of stillness, of lessons learned quietly and deeply, of the years when her voice had first learned to steady itself against the weight of the world. The days passed gently now, each one measured by the rhythm of her small routine's morning tea, letters written in careful script, afternoon walks along the Hudson where the air smelled faintly of iron and sea salt. Her body had slowed, but her mind remained clear, alert, and full of stories that refused to fade. She had begun writing those stories down, not for fame or publication, but for remembrance. Each evening she sat at her old wooden desk beneath the yellow glow of a reading lamp, filling pages with the history of her improbable journey. The waitress who became a translator, the translator who became a bridge, the bridge who became a teacher. Her handwriting had grown shakier with time, but her words were more certain than ever. She wrote of silence and of courage, of the weight of compassion, of the way one act of integrity could ripple through generations. Sometimes she imagined her husband sitting across from her, nodding quietly as he used to when she spoke of language and its miracles. It comforted her to believe he still listened. Ethan's letters arrived less frequently now. His work overseas kept him in motion, building programs for peace where conflict once ruled. Yet every letter carried the same warmth news of progress, reflections on human nature, and always a note of gratitude for her influence. "You taught me to lead without shouting," he wrote once, "and to believe that every disagreement is just a conversation waiting for the right translator." She smiled when she read it, tucking the letter into a box with dozens of others. Between them, words had long replaced any need for confession. They had reached a language beyond speech, one built on shared experience and mutual reverence. One afternoon, as she walked past the old Caldwell Systems building, she noticed a large poster displayed in the lobby window, an announcement for the company's 50th anniversary gala. Beneath the gilded text was a photograph hers, taken years ago during a conference, smiling modestly beside Ethan and a group of young translators. For a moment she stood motionless, her reflection layered over her younger self, two versions of the same woman gazing at each other through glass. A security guard approached and asked if she wanted to come inside for the event. She shook her head, her smile serene. "I've already been part of it," she said softly. "Now it belongs to them." That evening she returned home and found an envelope waiting by her door. The handwriting was unmistakable, Ethan's though weaker than before. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged, but the message unmistakably clear. "If I don't make it back to New York this winter, promise me you'll keep teaching. The world still needs your language." For a long while, Clara sat with the letter pressed to her chest, her heart trembling with a mixture of sadness and quiet pride. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered into the dim room, "I promise." Weeks passed, and the city shifted once more into the cold rhythm of November. News came quietly. Ethan had passed away during a trip in Nepal, his final work unfinished but his legacy immense. The fellowship in her name would now be expanded under his foundation, reaching thousands of students across the globe. Clara attended the memorial held in a small chapel near Central Park. The service was understated, dignified, filled with faces from every stage of his career. When she was invited to speak, she rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the podium. "Ethan believed power was a language," she began. "He spent his life learning to make it fluent in kindness." Her voice didn't waver. "And if he were here, he'd remind us that understanding is the only currency that never loses value." The room fell silent, and for a moment she could almost feel him listening. After the service, she walked through the park as snow began to fall. The world softened into shades of white and quiet gray. Children laughed in the distance, their joy rising like music. Clara paused beneath an elm tree, brushing a layer of snow from the bench before sitting down. The city around her pulsed with life, the same city that had once humiliated, tested, and ultimately redeemed her. She thought of all the people she had met along the way, the frightened waitress who first learned to speak, the furious billionaire who learned to listen, the students who now carried their lessons into the future. Every life she'd touched felt like a syllable in a greater language, one that translated suffering into strength and isolation into connection. In the months that followed, she continued to write, her stories evolving into reflections less about herself and more about the collective humanity she had witnessed. She began teaching small community workshops on communication and empathy, attended by immigrants, nurses, bus drivers, and young students. She would begin each class with the same line: "Every person you meet speaks a language you can only hear if you're willing to listen." And every time she said it, the room grew still, as if everyone recognized the truth in their bones. One evening, after a class, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "My mother always said words can't change anything," the woman said. "But you proved her wrong." Clara smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Words don't change things," she replied softly. "People who mean them do." That night, she returned home to her quiet apartment. The city lights shimmered through her window, painting silver patterns across the floor. She sat by her desk, pen in hand, finishing the final page of her memoir. Her last line came to her easily, as if it had waited years to be written. "I learned that speaking is not about being heard, it's about making understanding possible." When she set down the pen, the clock ticked steadily in the background, the sound of time both distant and kind. She looked out at the skyline glowing against the dark, the same city that had once reduced her to silence, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to speak." In that moment, surrounded by her books, her letters, and the soft hum of the world outside, Clara Dawson felt the full weight of her journey settle into peace. Redemption, she realized, wasn't about erasing pain, it was about transforming it into something others could walk across safely. Her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever chosen courage over comfort, understanding over pride, and kindness over power. And, as the night deepened, her apartment glowed softly with the light of a single lamp, the quiet flame of a life fully spoken, gently illuminating the silence it had once feared. Winter deepened, and the city that had once pulsed with ambition now moved under a thin veil of frost, quieter, slower, as if even its heartbeat had learned reflection. Clara's apartment overlooked the Hudson, where patches of ice floated like fragments of memory, breaking apart beneath the morning light. Her health had grown fragile, though her spirit remained luminous. Each breath felt deliberate, a conversation between her body and the years it had carried. Friends visited, often former students, young professionals, translators who had come through her fellowship, and each departure left behind the faint scent of gratitude and reverence. They called her Professor, though she never once claimed the title for herself. To them, she was something rarer, a keeper of empathy, a teacher of silence that spoke louder than words. On one of those still mornings, she sat at her writing desk, the same one that had followed her from her tiny apartment above the restaurant to this modest home by the river. The stack of journals beside her had grown tall, each filled with reflections, fragments of advice, and translations of poems she loved. Yet today, she found herself unable to write. Instead, she gazed at the sunlight trembling across the window pane, remembering all the rooms where she had once stood uncertain, where courage had sounded like a whisper trying to survive the noise. She thought of the night at Aurora Prime, the clink of silverware, the sudden hush, the look of disbelief on Ethan's face as she spoke, and she smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pride and forgiveness. Her doorbell rang that afternoon, and when she opened it, she found a familiar face. The young waitress from the cafe months before stood there, holding a small bouquet of lilies wrapped in brown paper. "I don't know if you remember me," she began nervously, "but you helped me once when I couldn't understand my customers." Clara laughed softly. "Of course I remember. How are you managing?" The girl's eyes shone. "Better now. I'm studying languages, Japanese and Spanish. I wanted to thank you." She hesitated before adding, "I read about you. Everyone says you changed people's lives. But I think you just made them listen." Clara touched her arm gently. "That's more than enough." "I?" After the girl left, Clara sat for a long time with the lilies in her lap, their white petals trembling with the faint draft from the window. She realized how strange it was that the smallest kindnesses she had given without thought had become the stories others remembered her by. Legacy, she thought, was not what you built with power, but what remained when your words became echoes in other people's mouths. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Clara received a letter bearing the seal of the United Nations. It was an invitation to a commemorative ceremony, the Global Language of Peace Conference, dedicated to the late Ethan Caldwell and his lifelong work in intercultural understanding. The closing keynote, the letter said, would be delivered by Clara Dawson, co-founder and mentor. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her hands trembling slightly. Age had made travel difficult, yet something deep within her stirred a quiet certainty that this was the chapter her story had been waiting for. The following week she arrived at the Grand Auditorium in Geneva, escorted gently by a young volunteer from the foundation. The hall was filled with translators, diplomats, and students from across the world. When she stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed slightly, and for a heartbeat the silence felt like home. She began to speak slowly, her voice fragile but unwavering. "When I was a young woman," she said, "I believed words existed only to fill silence. Now I know silence exists, so that words can find their meaning." The audience leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of her calm. "I have seen languages divide, and I have seen them heal. But what endures, what truly changes hearts, is not fluency. It is sincerity." She paused, letting the stillness settle like snow before continuing. "A single act of listening can end 1,000 misunderstandings. And if my life has taught me anything, it's that dignity is not given by power, it is revealed by compassion." When she finished, the applause was quiet at first, then grew into a steady, standing wave. She bowed her head, not as a symbol of pride, but as one final gesture of humility. Later that evening, she returned to her hotel room, overlooking the faint glimmer of Lake Geneva. The moonlight spilled across the floor, reflecting against her walking cane, which rested beside the bed like a silent companion. She poured herself a cup of tea, the scent of jasmine rising in the still air, and sat by the window. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to imagine her husband's voice, Ethan's laughter, the chorus of every life she had crossed. The sound of their memory blended with the distant hum of the city, until it became one soft, continuous notepiece itself speaking back to her. In the morning, she rose early, dressed simply, and walked to the lakefront. The air was crisp, the water mirroring the pale blue of dawn. She sat on a bench, watching the ripples stretch outward from a single dropped leaf. Every movement reminded her of translation, the way meaning expands, touching what it was never meant to reach, yet belonging everywhere it goes. A child nearby was feeding swans, his laughter ringing like sunlight. Clara smiled, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. She felt no fear, only fullness, the quiet recognition that her story had found its final cadence. Days later, when the foundation announced her passing, the world responded not with mourning, but with gratitude. Tributes poured in from cities she had never visited, written in dozens of languages, each one carrying her lesson forward. That kindness, when spoken with conviction, is the most fluent language of all. The fellowship she founded expanded again, renamed the Dawson-Caldwell Initiative for Human Understanding. Students recited her words at graduations, teachers quoted her in classrooms, and somewhere in New York, a young waitress told her story to a room full of diners who listened in stunned silence. And so, Clara Dawson's voice lived on, not in noise or fame, but in the spaces between people, in the pause before judgment, in the choice to listen when speaking would be easier. The waitress who once froze a restaurant with courage had become the whisper that thawed the world with grace. And as the city lights flickered far away beneath the endless sky, Her story continued not as an ending, but as an invitation for others to begin. The years that followed Clara Dawson's passing unfolded like pages from a story that refused to end, each one written quietly by those she had touched. The world kept moving, impatient as always, but within the spaces she once occupied, conference halls, classrooms, and boardrooms, a new language began to form. It was softer, slower, and profoundly human, built not on the vocabulary of profit but on the grammar of empathy. Her fellowship grew into a global initiative, stretching across continents and disciplines. Children in rural villages studied through programs funded by her name, while executives in towering offices quoted her teachings in strategy meetings without realizing the depth of the humility behind them. She had become an invisible architect of decency, her influence absorbed into the moral infrastructure of how people chose to speak to one another. In New York, the Caldwell Systems headquarters had transformed into a modern glass monument to innovation, but its heart remained rooted in her legacy. Near the building's entrance stood a bronze plaque etched with her words, "Power is not the ability to command it, is the grace to listen." Visitors often stopped to read it, unaware that the quote had been born in a moment of quiet defiance from a woman who once wore a waitress's uniform. Each morning the staff walked past it, some nodding in acknowledgement, others pausing briefly as if to steady themselves before stepping into the whirlwind of commerce. No one could deny that the company's culture had changed since her time. Meetings began with moments of silence, and negotiations were guided by empathy rather than dominance. The shift felt subtle yet irreversible, like a melody that lingered long after the final note. Every year, on the anniversary of her passing, the fellowship hosted a global symposium in her honor. Scholars, linguists, and diplomats gathered to discuss the evolving art of communication and the ethics of power. The event always opened with a short film depicting the night that had started it all, the restaurant scene, the frozen room, the single act of courage that altered the course of so many lives. New generations watched in astonishment as the story unfolded, not as legend, but as a reminder that greatness often begins unnoticed, hidden in ordinary gestures of conscience. Among the attendees, there was always someone moved to tears, a student, a translator, a young professional who suddenly recognized themselves in the reflection of her courage. One such attendee was a young woman named Lila Tanaka, a graduate from the fellowship's first international cohort. She had grown up hearing Clara's story from her grandmother, a server at the Tokyo restaurant, where the pivotal business meeting